Now, the first question I think to put to anybody here is, do you really want this? Because it's not, it might sound easy to do some lesson tweaking, but it isn't going to be all plain sailing here. So the analogy is we call it like an iceberg. You've got the surface learning up the top, that's the visible bit, that's the easy to see bit. But the larger part, which is often hidden and harder to articulate, is the bigger challenge. So if all you want is GCSE success, then you don't need to come to this webinar because you know how to do that, right? I don't need to tell you anything. But seeing as you're here, you probably have bigger goals for science. And they might look like this. At least they were the goals that most people have told me when I do face-to-face sessions. We want students to be ready, prepared for further study and interested in a STEM career. And we also want the ones who are not going on to STEM to be literate so they can take part in the issues facing society and think scientifically. That's the point of this 11-year education. So that's why you need this, because the surface learning won't do it. Literally will allow you to memorize and have some basic knowledge, but it won't be enough to go further. And as I'm sure discussions going on in school, in a world full of AI, who needs someone who can just master surface learning? So what do we mean by the difference? Well, quite obviously, the surface is the easy stuff to translate. Oh, you can't hear me. Someone can't hear me. Can everybody else hear me? Can I just have a quick message in the chat to say you can hear me? Yes. So I think someone's got a problem with the sound. If you can try and change that, or you can, always rejoin the chat in a minute. Okay, so the deep transferable stuff is what's harder to put into the words. We call them key concepts. In other words, the complex ideas, which are taken further into application and analysis as they're defined in GCSE. And that's actually what we need for the future, isn't it? Students who can apply and use what they know rather than just recall it. But at the same time, it goes broader because in order to do those things well, they need to understand how to actually practice science. And that's more than just experimental skills. There are skills, but they're more complex, like, understanding how to interpret evidence. That's not something you can teach with a worksheet in one go. It takes a long time to develop. And there's lots of sort of conceptual ideas within working scientifically as well. And in fact, there's even a third dimension, which will tell you, how good they are at reasoning, problem solving, creative thinking, working in a team, all the things that employers will want and schools increasingly are expected to deliver. So that's a broad curriculum to achieve bigger goals. And our idea of surface to deep to transfer was influenced a little bit by John Hattie, who moved on from all his meta-analysis league tables to saying, well, it's not just a question of, this is what I do. It's what do I do at different stages, right? Because learning is more like a journey than just getting knowledge. It takes some surface knowledge at the beginning so that you can go to the next stage and connect things together, right? And deepen your understanding, and then go to the next stage of apply it. It's not kind of rigid, but that's just a sort of broad progression. Now, we were doing the same sort of process of thinking and realized that in science, that wasn't clear enough. We actually thought you need at least 5 stages. Maybe you need more, but we definitely know you need these 5. Otherwise, you're missing something important. So whereas a traditional curriculum might focus rather too much on, reviewing or activating knowledge and then acquiring new knowledge, but stopping basically there, we think it has to go further, applying and analyzing. So acquire being the main stage, but you can't forget all the other ones if you want to go deeper. And so then let's get on to the tweaks. We're going to start with number 1 is going to be curiosity, and they follow, excuse me, going the wrong way here. They follow this sequence. We're going to start with a tweak for activate, then one for acquire, and we're going to stick with that part of the sequence today. And in the next session, in a week, we'll go on to apply and analyze. So number one, curiosity, and then models, concrete preparation, just-in-time skills, and analogies. I call these lesson tweaks, but actually that's a misnomer. If you just try and apply them mechanically, a bit like students applying their knowledge mechanically, you don't get very far. You really have to understand how they work. So I've tried to blend in what follows a little bit of the why and the evidence, but mostly on the how, so that you will see what to do, but you'll also feel confident that you know why it works. So curiosity. Let's start with what we're trying to turn from a surface learning to a deep learning approach. Let's say we're teaching energy transfer and you're trying to introduce it. So, you know, an unimaginative scheme, and these are all taken from schemes that we found. I won't give the names, but you'll probably work them out. They're kind of what the writer on the weekend happened to first think of and just put into the worksheet or the teacher's guide. So they're not terribly imaginative, and you can certainly do a lot better. But let's take that as an example. So you just tell students, oh, this is an example of energy, and you try and find some around the room. Okay, so yeah, they might be slightly engaged, but this is not curiosity. So what is curiosity? I think best to think of it in a kind of biological evolutionary context here. It's an investment strategy for your mental energy, right? It's clearly adaptive, because if humans weren't curious, they wouldn't find out about the natural environment or the social environment, and they wouldn't be able to take advantage of all the resources that they need to eat, drink, procreate. So curiosity is kind of the drive to find out. And interestingly, in recent years, it's been possibly shown to be on the same level of importance as intelligence and effort, which you surely know are the super important factors in achievement. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you're not curious, you're not going to put much effort into finding out, and you're not going to do the sort of deep learning that will improve your achievement. Now, we think there's three parts. People used to say, why bother to motivate students with all these, you know, exciting, engage activities? Because in the end, they still have to learn the boring stuff. But if you just say, here's a fascinating experiment, right now, let's get to the boring equation. Of course, you've lost the opportunity. But if you take that as a hook and then you move to these two further stages of questions, then I hope to show you why that will increase this investment in thinking. So there's three kinds that we typically use. A phenomenon that's surprising, can't be expected, has to have some element of surprise. It's called a discrepant event in the literature. That's one, because that clearly is adaptive. If you focus on novelty, that's interesting. The second one, which is harder to do, I have to admit, is narrative, because we all have a human interest and we're all driven to find out about stories. And thirdly is a dilemma question. So something that makes you like an issue that concerns you. This is something you'll want to investigate. So two examples I'm going to give you very fast. And the first one is a surprising phenomena. I will attempt to show this on video. I have to switch here, share screen onto, let me see. Now, can you tell me if you can see this YouTube video? Can you see that? I think it's visible. So I'm going to play just a second. This is called a Gauss gun. It's worth making or getting your technician to make, because it's really surprising.
Roll a fourth steel ball bearing down the ramp toward the neodymium magnet. As the ball bearing approaches the magnet, the acceleration will become greater and greater. And upon impact, the momentum will be transferred, similar to the way the...
Okay, so here's an even more dramatic version of it. You can have four of these things coupled together.
You can even put more than one stage in a row, so that it gains more and more energy as each stage is completed.
So you can actually make it into a gun. I'm going to turn that off, back, and we share here. You can do that. Excuse me a second. All right, hopefully you can see the screen again. So what we did was, okay, so we started off with the hook, right? And then you do your, excellent questioning, and you lead them to this question that they should hopefully take on as their own goal to find out, why did that ball come out so fast, right? Enough to damage a target. So that's just the beginning, of course, because we haven't got to the physics part yet. But then you can lead them to the all-important physics question, which we call the explore question, which is, why does the energy stored depend on mass? And that leads to speed and mass. So that leads to an actual investigation, a short one, to look at what happens when you change those variables. Now, so what you see is you get the interest and you hook that to the science question. And then when you've answered the science question, you finally come back and you can answer the original question of, well, why does this work? And you can then explain it. So in a sense, the hook gives you the motivation to learn the science if you set up the question, and then you get the payoff in the end with the answer. So here's another example, a different kind of hook. Same sort of topic, energy and temperature. This comes from a recent scheme, triggering interest apparently by showing a picture of a volcano and then ask why the rocks melt. And yeah, apparently that's the way to go into energy and temperature. Well, we don't think that's terribly good. But what would you do better? You actually have to put in some thinking here, right? Here's the way our thinking process to come up with a better trigger for curiosity, which is, well, if you're talking about energy and heat, right? Who uses this idea of temperature difference and the rate of cooling, right? Who uses that? Forensic scientists. They use that because they can do things like work out time of death from measuring temperature change. So we could construct a forensic case, and which would allow us to set a sort of context, a fake murder, and end up with a question. Could the boyfriend be guilty of murdering his girlfriend? And it will all depend on the time of death that you can estimate from doing an experiment, and whether he was there at the time. And that will lead us into the actual physics of how does temperature change depend on mass or temperature difference. So you see how you can hook and then lead towards the science. Okay, that's number one. I won't have time to stop, but I will be doing a longer version of this in an online course if you're interested in knowing the background in more detail. I hope that gave you a little bit of inspiration. Now let's go on to the next stage, and we call this build models. So typically in a surface approach, we have rather limited goals, right? Stores of energy. I'm sticking with physics, and then we'll move to biology. So these limited goals, stores and laws, I call it, and circuses, that time-honored technique of just learning what's in what, and it doesn't get you very far, according to the energy researchers. This is really not very helpful for future learning. And this is the problem. So we've defined our surface, but we seem to have forgotten in the surface learning approach that there's much more to energy than that. In Blueprint, we did do the extra mile and say, what is the model that they could usefully learn good enough to then become more quantitative later? So this is the idea that you model energy as an imaginary substance. And we're going to use a nice graphic visual representation for that. And then towards the end of the sequence, you can actually see how it's quantified, because after all, it's just a mathematical concept. So it starts, get the visual model, all right? Energy bars, and some things have more and less, and it's in different places, and we can animate that, and we can see how we can relate each store to an energy bar. So that's basically giving them the thinking tool, but that's surface, right? Then they can do a little investigation. I think you saw before, how does energy in kinetic store depend on mass and speed? So they do that experiment, and here's the explanation with animation, which I won't show you, to show that, if it's slow, you've got a small energy bar. If it's big, you've got a large energy bar. And you can actually then say, well, these car and motorbike examples, how do they compare in energy? And the kids are thinking with this model. They can see that the low mass of the relative mass of the motorcycle means they'll have a lower energy, and the car will have a higher one, or at different speeds. And they're building a semi-quantitative model of energy stores that's actually useful, because you can easily turn that into a quantitative mathematical formula at key stage 4. So I think that should be the goal with every concept. Build a model that's useful and prepares you for later, more advanced learning. Okay, tweak 3. I'll have a brief pause for air in case you have any questions, because I haven't been following the chat. No questions? Going so fast that you can't keep up. Right, let's go on to number 3. So concrete preparation. Anyone who's half as old as me might remember the 1990s, where the CASE Cognitive Acceleration Project invented this term. And it's a kind of antidote to the sort of teaching which gets stuck thinking like, there's surface learning. Yes, we can do something to put these organisms in order and realize the simple idea that things get more complex over time. But what do we do to get them to an understanding of natural selection? We just explain it. We just give them the model fully formed and hope that they can, bridge that gap. But it doesn't usually happen. And that's what the CASE people in the 1990s realized, that most kids weren't able to make these abstract leaps. So we need to help them. And I think the best solution, based on various lines of evidence, is to put this explore stage in between the simple, surface learning and the deep explanations. The students actually need to do some of the work themselves. There's 4 lines of research here if you want to convince your colleagues of this. One is called Time for Telling, and I'll publish all of these papers after the webinar. Time for Telling is a very famous bit of research that showed that if you compared students who were basically given all the information first and then told the examples the traditional way, compared with they experienced it first and then were told, that group did better. It's like the concrete experience prepared them to make more sense of the explanations. So we're not saying don't explain or do direct instruction, not at all. What we're saying is there's a real time when you can best make sense of a complicated explanation, when you're ready for it. And that's really well demonstrated by the Singapore maths approach. They took that from the American psychologist, Jerome Bruner, and they called it concrete pictorial abstract. And we basically do the same thing in our science course. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. There's other research that shows that multiple representations, like concrete ones, visual ones, bodily ones, they all help to make this understanding richer. And finally, of course, there's the CASE project, which did this really well. A very simple analogy, because we're going to come on to analogies in a minute, I can give you here, is that if you like, imagine you're watching Agatha Christie movie and you were trying to make sense of Poirot's explanation of the murder without having watched the hour beforehand. It would be very hard, wouldn't it? Because you wouldn't know the characters, their motivations, and how they interacted with each other, right? So think of the first hour as the detective collecting pieces of the puzzle. In your science lesson, the equivalent is they're doing this explore activity. The students are collecting pieces of this puzzle that you want them to put together, which is the abstract idea. But first they collect the pieces. This is the sort of basic knowledge, concrete knowledge that they need. And then when you finally explain, your full energy model or your full natural selection model, they have the pieces and you're just helping them connect them, which is much, lower cognitive load than if they didn't have the pieces in the first place. So that's really the point of the explore. And here's the example of how to do it with natural selection. So we start with the concrete and we start with a simulation of how the various stages of natural selection work. The best example that we adapted was this one of 3 types of creature who compete for food, the hoppers, jumpers, and walkers. And some of them do better than others, and therefore you can see how the ones who do less well might go extinct, and the ones who do better will breed. So you've got variation leading to competition, leading to survival. And if you keep going through different rounds, you get to reproduction. And the students have actually experienced this with their bodies, many kinds of representations that have been formed. And that's the concrete. And then when you come to the reflection, post simulation, this is when you help turn that into a more pictorial understanding, so they can see that the first step is variation. What does variation mean? Okay, so it's different features on these people or different features on an animal. And then you go through all of those at a pictorial level, and then you can abstract. You can just take the essential features of variation, and then you can go from one stage to the next in a very abstract form. But remember, you've got that concrete and pictorial representations behind it that the students can go back to, so they really can understand this model and use it. Right, that's 3 done, 2 to go. Hope you're following this. Now we come to the working scientifically, and our approach to this in a deep learning model is just in time, right? What we dislike is this idea that we've done friction. Here's the example. This comes direct from a scheme. We're going to be doing inquiry today, right? We're going to test all our inquiry skills as we plan and do and identify and control and everything, all in one experiment. What's wrong with that? Well, basically, it's like saying, I'm going to teach tennis by practicing tennis. You don't get very much better at all the individual skills because they need to be decomposed, taken apart, taught, given feedback, practiced, and then put back together again. So it doesn't really work to mix everything up until you can do each of the skills well. So we think, much more weight is working scientifically in teaching. And Ofsted agree, in their recent report, they said it should be integrated and taught. Of course, GCSE requires that too, at AO3 in particular. There's lots of questions that require you to be pretty automatic with some of the scientific skills. And if you're aiming for bigger goals like a STEM career or life, the researchers are quite clear that most of the science we really need is procedural. Yeah, I mean, you're not going to remember very much about the details of stem cells when it comes to knowing whether you need stem cell therapy. But you do need to know much more about risks and uncertainties and all that sort of stuff. And you can learn what content you need as you go. So our approach to integrating working scientifically is based on a philosophy. There's the only one philosophy that I'm going to share with you here, because it's the one I've been using ever since the word go that I started teaching. I didn't know it was called this. Here is the best articulation. David Perkins, Making Learning Whole. His basic argument is if you're playing sport or doing music or chess, you always play some junior version of the real game. Yes, you have skills and drills, but you're always going back to the game. But not so in many academic subjects like science, maths, history. Most of the time, it's like the batting practice, and you very rarely get to play the whole game. So motivationally, it's weak. And in terms of skill development, it's even weaker because you never get to integrate those skills that you might have learned. So how can we do that? There's some simple tweaks. The first one, of course, is to put the objectives clearly there. If you want the skills, you need a skill objective. One skill clearly identified. So here in the friction experiment, you're going to see is accurate data. And then ideally, if you're going to adopt this Perkins idea of a whole game, then you need to have students doing things like a scientist would do. In this case, if they're collecting data and there's quite a lot of data and you want them to talk about it, how about working as a team? They take different roles, and that gives them a reason to talk and discuss how good their collection is. So very simple experiment, but just given a tweak. So the friction is an investigation, but the focus is on doing a trial run and seeing what kind of results you get. And you'll see, or the students will very quickly see, that they get results all over the place, right? Because they're not very accurate at doing it. It's quite hard to get the right moment when the spring balance pulls the weight. So they get a big range and they can't get an accurate result. So there you go. There's the need for a skill in the context of doing science. And that's your teaching moment. So you teach the skill just in time. That's very straightforward. And then they practice it in the context again of that experiment, and they can see the benefit of using that skill in that moment. So it's more likely to be integrated. So that's it, a skills in time approach to inquiry, one skill at a time. Final tweak, analogies. So now we're in the explaining stage, and the typical surface approach would be, let's say, we'll take cell structure. You want students to be able to name the parts and what they do, sure, but that's just the surface. If they actually understood how a cell works, then they might be able to answer this question: what would happen to a cell if its mitochondria stopped working? I don't think most students would know the answer very well if they just knew the parts and what they did. This is why they need a model, but models are hard, so we have to scaffold that. And one of the best approaches is to use analogies, right? Analogies are classic. IQ tests are full of analogy questions, and they're there to test intelligence. And what they do is they say, what is tree to leaf compared to sea to, I don't know, seaweed? You're finding underlying similarities between things, and that is a sign of intelligence, but it's also a way to think, which we can all do. And it's a really good way to turn a simpler idea into a new, more difficult idea if you start with an analogy. It's been proven to work in a classic experiment. People couldn't solve problems where they were just told the principle, but if they knew an analogy as well as the principle, it became a lot easier, because the analogy is actually getting students to work on the deep structure of the concept. So it's scaffolding, basically. And here's an example. This is one from our book, and it's to treat the cell as a factory. It took a long time to work out the details, and analogies aren't always straightforward, but I think it works well. So what we do is we say a cell is like a factory, and most kids have some idea of a factory with robots making cars by these days. And if not, you can easily show that. So what we do is we go part by part and we draw the connections. So the cell's like the factory, and you can see how, pretty kind of static a cell is. You need to dramatize it, don't you, to show that it's actually lots of parts working together to do something. So a factory is quite a good model. The robots in the factory, easy to visualize, are like the ribosomes because they're doing the building. And the generator is supplying the energy to a factory, and that's like the mitochondria, and they need energy for everything to work. But someone actually has to direct the process. There's the manager in the factory, and it's the nucleus and the instructions in the cell. Finally, once everything's made, stuff has to get in and out, right? And that's the cell membrane's job. So you construct the analogy, you work through the analogy, get students to think about it, and then you apply it to problems like the mitochondria. And that should, with a bit of scaffolding, allow them to do it, because they've got a working model of what each bit does. And if you therefore stripped out that function, you can see the consequence. Okay, I've actually done my job and finished 1 minute before 30 minutes.